The applause was thunderous. Studio lights pulsed above the crowd, and Steve Harvey stepped onto the stage with his signature swagger, grinning like a man about to deliver another knockout hour of television. You know, Steve said, chuckling into the mic, our guest today is living proof that you can age like a fine wine, or at least like a protein shake in a leather boot. Laughter rippled through the audience. And I gotta say, he added, pausing for emphasis, if you've ever wondered what it looks like when the Terminator collects Social Security, today's your lucky day. That's when Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped out from behind the curtain. He didn't smile, he didn't wave, he didn't play to the crowd. He walked with the heavy, deliberate gait of a man not here to entertain, but to settle something. The cheers started to fade. A few people kept clapping, uncertain whether they should stop. Arnold's expression was unreadable stone carved into flesh. Steve extended his hand. Arnold, man, you're still looking like you could bench press this whole set. Arnold took the seat. He didn't shake Steve's hand. He didn't laugh. He looked him straight in the eye and said calmly but firmly, Steve, I need to speak before we go any further. The room fell quiet. Even the band, sensing something was off, cut the background music mid-note. Steve blinked. Oh, sure. What's on your mind, man? Arnold adjusted his jacket slow and controlled. I know what this show usually is. Laughs, nostalgia, surface-level fun. But I didn't come here for that. A pause. I came because something's been sitting on my chest for 3 years, and it's heavier than any weight I've ever lifted. Steve chuckled nervously. You mean like emotionally? Arnold didn't smile. I mean, you humiliated me on this very stage. The audience shifted. A few gasps. Someone dropped their phone in the second row. Arnold leaned forward, voice low but sharp. You made a joke about me being a relic. You said I was a statue from a forgotten war on national television, and you wore that cross, he pointed at Steve's chest, while you laughed at a man recovering from open-heart surgery. Steve sat back, eyes widening. I'm not here to cancel you, Arnold continued. I'm here to tell you what that laughter cost. He let the silence hang. Not dramatic, not performative, just heavy, human. And this won't be the show you thought it would be. Steve didn't speak. For once, the man whose job was to guide every conversation felt like a passenger in his own studio. Arnold sat upright, hands resting calmly on his thighs. The control he carried wasn't just physical, it was moral. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. It was February 2019, Arnold said. I remember the exact date, not because of your joke, but because that morning I was discharged from Cedars-Sinai after my second open-heart surgery. He looked out into the audience now, his voice gaining weight without getting louder. My chest was held together by wire. I had a drainage tube removed 6 hours before, and that night lying in the dark, I turned on the television. He paused, and there you were. Steve shifted in his chair. The memory was coming back, but too slowly. You were standing right where you are now, Arnold continued, wearing that same smile, holding the mic like a sermon. And then came the line. He didn't need to quote it, but he did anyway. You said Arnold Schwarzenegger's still trying to act man. That dude's like a retired action figure. Somebody tell him the 80s called, they want their biceps back. The audience sat frozen. Steve tried to recover. Arnold, listen, that was just a joke. Arnold cut in, not with anger, but with finality. Do you think the incision on my chest laughed? Do you think my children laughed when I asked them to help me sit up that night? Silence. You mocked a man's survival. Steve dropped his gaze, visibly stung. Arnold's eyes didn't blink. And that clip, Steve, it wasn't just televised. It went viral. 4 million views in 48 hours. Headlines followed, Terminator terminated. Arnold looks like he needs a reboot. He drew a breath, not from anger, but to steady the next sentence. I became a punchline in the world I helped build. He leaned back now, just slightly, like the burden of the memory-needed room. And through it all, you wore that crucifix on your chest. Steve instinctively touched the chain around his neck, fingers tightening over the symbol like it could shield him from what it now represented. You wore it when you laughed. You wore it when the audience laughed with you. And I wonder, Steve, did you ever stop to think who wasn't laughing? The words struck deeper than volume ever could. There was no dramatic music, no monologue swell, just a man sitting beneath bright lights shining a mirror. Arnold closed his eyes for a brief second. I didn't respond. I didn't call your team. I didn't tweet. He opened them again, still steady, because I wanted to see if you'd notice. And you didn't. Steve's lips parted, but no words came out. That's why I'm here. The studio was quieter than it had ever been. No stage cues, no shifting cameras, no applause signs. Arnold didn't fill the silence. He let it breathe. After that episode aired, I didn't leave the house for weeks. He wasn't exaggerating. His words came like stone measured undeniable. You know what it's like to be stared at your whole life, to be recognized everywhere. But this time the recognition felt different. He looked toward the audience, not accusing, just remembering. This time I didn't hear Terminator. I heard washed up. I heard plastic surgery. I thought he died already. Steve exhaled sharply as if trying to interrupt, but Arnold held him with a glance. I canceled appearances, declined scripts. I turned down an award in Berlin because I didn't want to stand on stage and pretend I hadn't been gutted by a man I once respected. He tilted his head slightly, his voice lowering. I stopped training, stopped filming. I stopped calling my sons back. It beat. Because when the world laughs at your weakness, even the strongest man goes quiet. That line didn't need echo. It echoed itself. You know what the cruelest part was? He asked more to the air than to Steve. It wasn't the headlines. It wasn't the social media mockery. It was the silence that followed. The phone that didn't ring. The friends who didn't check in. The people who said nothing because they didn't want to pick sides. He looked down at his hands that had once won championships, clenched microphones, held the weight of nations. I used to feel invincible, but that month I couldn't even open a jar. Steve's face collapsed inward, folding beneath the guilt he hadn't realized he'd earned. They say when your body breaks, your mind compensates. But what happens when both give out at the same time? Arnold straightened, slow but intentional. You mocked my physical decline, but the real damage wasn't visible. He tapped his chest once firmly. It was right here, quiet, slow, and deadly. There was no audience laughter now, only the hollow ring of their earlier cheers. Steve finally spoke, voice thin. Arnold DeFree, I didn't know. Arnold nodded once, not in agreement, just in acknowledgement. That's the problem, Steve. You didn't have to know. That's what makes it dangerous. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked. Because you weren't just joking on a show, you were preaching on a stage. And your words cut like scripture, but landed like shrapnel. The cross on Steve's chest felt heavier. Now he touched it again, but this time with trembling fingers. Arnold sat back silent. The shame had landed, and it wasn't theatrical, it was biblical. Steve sat speechless, hands folded like a man on trial. The laughter was long gone, replaced by a silence so thick it muffled even the hum of studio lights. Arnold didn't gloat. He didn't pace. He didn't point fingers. He simply sat with the quiet authority of a man who'd walked through fire and returned carrying the smoke. I wasn't going to come here, he said calmly. I had nothing left to prove. Not to the world, not to you. He paused. But something happened one night that changed everything. And the irony is, it started with you. Steve looked up startled. Me? Arnold nodded. I was in my home office surrounded by medals, scripts, photos, trophies from a life that once roared, but none of it made a sound anymore. His voice softened, not cracked, but peeled open. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, couldn't sleep, couldn't breathe right. I felt like a guest in my own body. He looked at Steve, and out of nowhere, some algorithm, some divine accident, I see your face on my screen. Steve blinked. What video? You were speaking at a church. Small crowd, no teleprompter, just you holding a microphone like a confession. The room was still, even the cameras seemed to pause. You said something that night and I wrote it down. Not because I thought it was profound, but because it felt like a man was bleeding through his shirt. Arnold reached into his jacket pocket and slowly pulled out a folded paper. He didn't need to read it, he had memorized it. But holding it gave the moment weight. God doesn't waste pain, Arnold quoted. Sometimes your wound is the only way someone else knows they're not alone. Steve swallowed, eyes misting. I didn't know you said that, he whispered. Arnold folded the paper again. Neither did I, until I needed it. He leaned forward. I watched it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. but I didn't shut it off either. A faint breeze seemed to move through the studio, though no one stirred. That was the first night I didn't wish for silence. The first night I thought, maybe the fight wasn't over. He looked straight into Steve's eyes, but his voice stayed low. You didn't know you were saving me. That's what made it real. Steve's mouth opened, but no words arrived. That's why I'm here, Steve. Not for revenge. A pause. I came back because sometimes the one who wounds you is also the one who wakes you. And with that, the weight shifted. The silence didn't feel like accusation anymore. It felt like grace. Steve was still processing it. His own words, long forgotten, now echoed back to him by the very man he once unintentionally wounded. Arnold placed the folded paper on the coffee table between them, like it was something sacred, a relic. That night, he said, voice hushed but steady, I didn't feel inspired. I felt noticed. He let the line sit. No emphasis, no drama, just truth. It didn't fix me. Nothing does that. But it interrupted the silence. It gave me just enough room to breathe. Steve leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. So, what happened after that, he asked. Arnold looked up, a faint glint in his eye, not a tear, not yet, but something human. I walked to the kitchen. The audience didn't react, but Steve did, his brow furrowed. Arnold nodded slowly. That's it. That's the miracle. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, drank it. Not because I was thirsty, but because I was alive. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't resent that. He paused, letting the ordinary details speak for itself. The next day, I stepped into my home gym. I didn't lift anything. I just sat on the bench. Just sat. He gave a faint, almost invisible smile. No cameras, no music, no mirrors. Just me, breathing. Steve's hands had folded in his lap, fingers gently tightening. There was nothing performative about him anymore. It took weeks before I actually worked out again, Arnold continued. But each day I went back. I kept showing up. Not for a role, not for my name, for my soul. A long silence passed between them. And all that Steve finally said started from that one clip. Arnold's reply was soft but definitive. No, it started from that one sentence. The clip was just delivery. The message, that was oxygen. He looked around the studio now, as if finally acknowledging the audience, not as fans, but as witnesses. I've played men who fought wars, who lifted cars, who battled monsters. But the hardest thing I ever did was walk 5 feet to the kitchen and choose not to quit. He turned back to Steve. And that choice came from you. Steve's eyes welled. He shook his head gently, overwhelmed. I don't even remember saying it, he whispered. Arnold nodded. I do, word for word. Because in a moment when everything felt staged, you were real. The weight of it hung in the air, not a burden, but an inheritance. You saved me, Steve Arnold said. Not like in the movies. No explosions. No soundtrack. Just a voice that reached a man sitting in the dark. He leaned back, exhaling through his nose. And that's why I came here. Not to confront you, but to remind you of what you've forgotten. The studio didn't move. No one clapped, because no one wanted to miss the sound of healing. Steve sat still, shoulders low, his voice long buried under the weight of what he'd just heard. Arnold adjusted in his seat, not to lean in, not to dominate, but as if making space for something sacred about to rise between them. You once said, Arnold began, that pain has a language. Steve looked up slowly, eyes narrowing in recognition. Arnold's voice didn't tremble. It didn't perform. You said when someone who's been through hell speaks, people stop talking and start listening. Steve blinked, barely breathing. I wasn't looking for wisdom that night, Arnold continued. I wasn't looking for God. I wasn't even looking for hope. I just needed the noise in my head to stop. A pause. And then there you were, speaking not like a host, not like a comic, but like a man who had bled and didn't hide the stain. Steve's lips parted slightly. You said, Arnold's voice dropped now, almost a whisper. God doesn't call the perfect. He qualifies the broken. The words hit the air like a bell in a cathedral, clean, resonant, undeniable. And I realized I wasn't finished, Arnold said. Not because I felt strong again, but because someone somewhere once stood where I was and chose to speak instead of disappear. He looked at Steve, and this time the strength wasn't defiance. It was gratitude forged in fire. You didn't know who you were talking to, but I did. Steve slowly ran his hand over his face, not to hide, but to wipe away something raw humility, maybe. Regret, awe. Arnold continued, his tone steady. That night, your words weren't just sentences. They were scaffolding. They held me together when I couldn't hold myself. Another breath. And now, I need to return them. Steve looked confused, almost afraid to ask. What do you mean? Arnold leaned forward just slightly. I need to say them back to you, because I think you may have forgotten the power they hold. Steve sat there stunned. Sometimes you're not the one being rescued, Arnold said. Sometimes you're the rescuer, and you don't even know it. Steve's hand instinctively touched the crucifix at his chest again, but this time it wasn't defense, it was anchoring. You thought you were just giving a speech, Arnold said, but you were lighting a fire in someone whose life had gone cold. A pause, then, that someone was me. The room didn't clap, it didn't move. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, afraid to interrupt. Steve finally exhaled, voice cracking. I don't know what to say. Arnold smiled faintly, the first true smile of the evening. You already said it, Steve, years ago, when you thought no one was listening. A beat. But I was. Steve Harvey sat with his hands clasped tightly, the weight of silence pressing against his chest, like a stone too sacred to remove. Arnold hadn't moved since his last words. He didn't need to. The stillness wasn't awkward, it was earned. It pulsed with consequence. Steve finally spoke, his voice rough and raw. Arnold, I didn't mean to hurt you. Arnold looked at him. Not coldly, not kindly, just honestly. But you did. The sentence didn't land like an accusation. It landed like a gravestone etched final. The audience didn't flinch. They were no longer spectators, they were witnesses. You hurt me in front of millions, Arnold continued. And the thing is, I wasn't mad. Steve furrowed his brow, confused. Arnold clarified, calm as ever. I was ashamed that I let myself become easy to ridicule. Ashamed that a man I respected laughed while I bled under my skin. Steve's throat tensed. I thought I was just being funny. Arnold nodded once. That's the most dangerous kind of pain, Steve, the kind you package in laughter and send to the world without checking the return address. He sat back now, exhaling, not for show but release. But that's not why I came here. A pause, a beat, a shift. I didn't fly here to break you. I came to give you back something you dropped. Steve looked up, eyes misting. Dropped. Arnold leaned forward, his voice gentler now, but no less firm. Your fire, your purpose. He gestured lightly toward Steve's chest. You wear that cross like a badge, but you used to carry it like a calling. Steve blinked hard, his mouth trembling. You think I came here to shame you? I didn't. He paused. I came here to remind you that your voice reached a man in silence. So don't let the noise of applause drown out the reason you picked up the mic in the first place. Steve sat back slowly, breath shallow, chin quivering. You think you're just a host, Arnold said. But I've seen pastors with pulpits smaller than your stage. A long moment passed. Then, you called me a relic once, Arnold added, his voice now soft. But the truth is, you were the one buried under laughter. I just came to dig you out. Steve covered his mouth with one hand. A tear slipped through his fingers. The audience remained perfectly still. No one clapped. No one shifted. Because everyone could feel it. This wasn't confrontation, it was resurrection. Arnold sat back again, this time with finality. You saved me, Steve. And tonight, I came to return the favor. Steve's hand lingered at his chest, fingers curled tightly around the crucifix he'd worn for years, without thought, without question. Arnold's voice broke through the stillness, not forceful, not urgent, but weighted with quiet clarity. You wear that cross like it's part of your wardrobe. Steve's eyes lifted, caught between guilt and curiosity. But that cross, Arnold continued, it wasn't made to accessorize your suits. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gaze anchored. It was made to remind you who you are when the lights go off. Steve swallowed hard, the chain suddenly heavier. Arnold's voice was unwavering now. That symbol you carry, it saved me once. Not because of its shine, but because of what I believed it meant coming from you. He gestured to the air between them as if holding something invisible, yet undeniable. You stood on a stage years ago preaching without permission. You spoke about storms, about wounds, about how faith doesn't need polish to be powerful. Steve blinked rapidly, remembering, maybe too well. You called it a calling, Arnold said. You said God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. I heard that in your voice before I ever saw it in your eyes. He paused, but somewhere along the way, you started hiding behind the laughs. Steve shifted slightly as if trying to escape the spotlight, now aimed not at his fame, but at his spirit. Arnold didn't relent, not to attack, but to awaken. You've been carrying a pulpit without realizing it. Steve looked at him, torn wide open. But I'm not a preacher. Arnold offered a half smile, gentle but piercing. Neither was Moses. A few gasps stirred from the audience. Arnold didn't acknowledge them. He wasn't performing. You don't need a church to be chosen. You don't need robes to carry the word. And you don't need permission to speak healing into the world. He let that sit, then leaned back. You thought you were just telling jokes, Steve. But sometimes God wraps sermons in comedy because that's how broken people listen. Steve's lips trembled. I thought I was just surviving, he said quietly. Arnold nodded. That's what makes you dangerous in all the right ways. He pointed one softly to Steve's chest. That crucifix, it's not a souvenir. It's not just a memory of who you were. It's a signal to you and to everyone watching that you carry something holy inside the ordinary. Steve stared down at the cross now, as if seeing it for the first time. Arnold's voice softened. And tonight I needed you to remember that, because I remembered it for you when you forgot. The air didn't move. The room didn't shift. But something had undeniably changed. The cross was no longer decoration. It was a commission. Steve didn't speak at first. His fingers stayed curled around the crucifix like a man holding the last thread of a memory that had nearly unraveled. The studio was still, not out of reverence alone, but out of recognition. Everyone knew they were watching a man who had run out of ways to hide from himself. Then finally Steve whispered, "Why me?" His voice cracked over the syllables like they'd been waiting behind his ribs for years. Arnold didn't blink. Because the ones who bleed quietly are often the ones who speak the loudest to the broken. Steve looked down the words, wrapping around him like a mirror. There are better men than me, he said. Cleaner, stronger, more faithful. Arnold shook his head slowly, and none of them would have reached me. He leaned in tone, steady as truth. God doesn't wait for perfect vessels. He uses cracked ones because the light gets through. Steve let out a small, humorless laugh. I've thought about quitting, more than once. Arnold nodded. So have I. Steve glanced at him, his shoulders easing, just slightly pain recognizing itself in another body. There were nights, Steve said, when I stood backstage before taping and thought, what am I even doing here? He looked out at the crowd but didn't address them. I've doubted my own worth, my faith, even my voice. His hand tapped his chest once above the cross. I've worn this because I didn't want to forget, but maybe I did anyway. Arnold spoke softly. You didn't forget, you just needed someone to say it back to you. He paused, then added, that's not failure, that's grace looking for a landing place. Steve exhaled through his nose, nodding once, tears gathering but not yet falling. You said something earlier, he murmured, about me being buried under laughter. Arnold held his gaze. Steve straightened a little. I think you were right. His eyes found the audience now not as a performer, but as a man who had just stepped out of a long tunnel. I've used this stage to bring joy, he said, but I forgot it could also bring truth. He turned to Arnold. And I forgot that sometimes I'm not the host. Arnold tilted his head. Steve continued, his voice growing steadier. Sometimes I'm the one in the seat, the one who needed the message. A long pause followed. So thank you for preaching when I didn't even know I was in church. Arnold gave a slight nod, the kind that said, no need to thank me. You were always meant to remember. And for the first time all night, Steve's hand dropped from the crucifix. Not because it no longer mattered, but because he no longer needed to hold it to know it was his. The studio didn't breathe. Steve Harvey sat still, his body upright but fragile, like something heavy had just been lifted and yet left a permanent mark on the structure. Across from him, Arnold remained silent. Not as a threat, not as a legend, but as a witness who had finished testifying. For a moment, it felt like the cameras should cut, that this was the kind of ending not meant for broadcast, too personal, too raw. But no one moved. Steve slowly looked out toward the audience, not to perform, not to seek validation, but as if seeing them for the first time in years. Not a crowd, a congregation. Then he turned to Arnold again. You ever wonder why it's the broken ones that reach the furthest? Arnold answered without delay. Because we don't speak from books, we speak from scars. Steve exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, almost a cry. He stood. The motion wasn't grand. It didn't call for applause. It was reverent, like rising in a church after a moment of prayer that had left something in the air. Arnold rose with him. They stood face to face, no longer host and guest, no longer comic and icon, just two men shaped by the same fire carrying different smoke. Steve's lips parted, the question trembling before it fell. Why me, man? Arnold didn't flinch. He stepped forward, not too close, not invasive, but enough that only Steve could hear the words as they were meant. Because God doesn't need a pulpit. He just needs someone who's walked through something and didn't stay silent about it. Steve swallowed. Arnold added quieter now. You thought your gift was laughter, but it was always language, truth disguised in joy. He pointed gently, not at Steve's chest, but at the chair Steve had been sitting in. You don't need to carry that cross anymore to remember who you are. You just needed to sit still long enough to hear it again. Steve nodded slowly, a tear slipping down the side of his face without resistance. Arnold reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Not heavy, just enough. You saved me once with your words. A pause. Now go save somebody else. Steve looked down for a moment, then back up clear-eyed. He turned to the audience, his voice low but grounded. I've had a lot of moments on this stage. He looked back at Arnold. But this was the holiest one. No one clapped. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Then Steve whispered, let's pray. And in that instant, the room changed. There were no jokes, no themes, no outro music. Just two men, a message returned, and a silence loud enough to move the world. If you enjoyed the story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.